Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest is Sandra Ionno Butcher, CEO of Britain's National Organization for FASD, which advocates with individuals and families dealing with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Sandy and I knew each other as early hires with an advocacy startup in Washington called the British American Security Information Council, aka BASIC, a group still working away today dedicated to nuclear disarmament. Sandy and I had a great discussion about what it's like for an American to watch what's been going on from 2,000 miles away, the wicked problem of nuclear weapons, and her shift from working on international peace and security to working on services for a population with special health and other needs. Spoiler alert, it's all about featuring the voices of affected people themselves. So all my podcast guests so far have been people I know. I haven't run out yet. I still have a few people I know to have on. But today is someone I go back 35 years with, and she's a great one. Sandy Butcher is an long time and dear friend, definitely long time, not old. We were colleagues at what you could describe as a startup advocacy group working on nuclear weapons issues, which we'll talk about. For the past 17 years, Sandy, originally from the Garden State, has lived in the United Kingdom. And a few years ago, Sandy made a career shift to be an advocate on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which we'll also talk about. Welcome, Sandy.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course.
35 years, how did that happen?
I don't know. I have to go off and see if I can reckon for all that time. So I want to go back to that lives in the UK thing for a moment. So here we are with our It Could Happen Here fascists and our very American coup attempt. And you're over there expatting. But in all seriousness, how do these difficult and dangerous times look to an American from over there?
Pressing. Not just as a kind of general expat, but also as from the policy work that we did. Sometimes you don't like to think that the gains made can be so easily overturned. I think that was a harsh lesson to learn from all of this. But I think it's a scary time. I think the world's watching what's happening in the US. I know here they are. What I find a little alarming, though, is that it's easy for people to look at the US and say, that's scary what's happening over there, when we're having similar things happening here, maybe on a different scale, maybe with the British accent it sounds better. I don't know, but there are similar trends here and in other parts of the world. I fear a little bit that some of these shifts have been a generational shift, and I really don't know how we got there. I really don't know how we went from moments of hope to where we are now. Over here, we're having similar things happening, and people don't necessarily identify that it's happening here in our backyard too.
I think the body politic in psychological terms, this is how I heard you, there's a denial of a kind, isn't there? That when you're confronted with the sort of thing that you know from the history books, or the sort of thing that, has happened other places, and you don't think of happening here, problem.
Well, I think that when the system gets like this, it's all players in the system get corroded by it too. And because you're having to respond to the extreme case, in this case, what's been going on in the Republican Party over the last years. The Democrats aren't necessarily always responding in the way that they might have done pre this moment. We're all changed. The whole dynamic is changed as a result of things. And I never realized it was so fragile. And the same thing's happening here in England. I mean, we've had Brexit. How frightening. When we chose, you said 17 years ago, when we chose to move our family from, we had comfortable lives in Washington, D.C. I'd been working there for some 16 years or something like that. We decided to pick up and move back to the town where my husband was from, partly because we wanted our kids to be able to have free university education. We wanted them to be able to be citizens of Europe. We appreciated the free healthcare. And, it's just a different society. But even living over here in that short amount of time, from the time when our kids were little to now they're just entering adulthood, it's all changed. They have to pay for university. I shouldn't complain because it's much more in the States, but this was a principle over here for a while. They no longer are citizens of Europe. The national healthcare system's under attack. There's similar things happening. So I think my biggest concern though is kind of the attempt at limiting education that's going on in the States. There's a meme going around saying it says something like, it's the Peanuts character sitting in a classroom and they say they're never going to teach you what you need to know to overthrow them. And I think what I'm worried about is that as they're cutting back on the broad education and they're limiting books more and their control, I worry what's going to come out of that. So yeah, no, it is. I watch the U.S. news in the middle of the night. I'm being old. I don't know if this happens to you too, but I wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night, and I put on the U.S. news then, and that's where I get in the middle of the night my dose of reality. And yeah, in a lot of ways, I'm glad that we're living over here and not there.
That's an important point about reversals and how you can't count on the progress that has been made, or the Democratic Republic is not a self-executing system, right? Like it really does depend ultimately on the citizenry and the voting public. Boy, conversation has taken a dark turn.
Yeah, we didn't start off in the more optimistic way, but on the other hand, my husband has become involved in green politics over here, and I wouldn't say that the Greens are, a nationally strong presence, but in the local area where we live, and one of the reasons why we almost didn't move here was because where he grew up was a Tory stronghold. He said it would always be a Tory stronghold. There would never be a chance when they weren't in power, because it's just in the DNA here. And just recently, he and other colleagues of his were part of a little mini green revolution in our district, and the Tories are no longer here. And it's happened in a couple other places in the country where the voters are just skipping from Tory straight to green because they don't think that the established political parties are realistic in understanding what the people actually want. And it's due to a lot of building on greenbelt lands and not having appropriate policies for making life just comfortable for people as they go about their business. So I don't know. Like I said, I think that we can't predict. I think when I studied political science and history, I always thought things just go, in general, on a nice trajectory. And I think what I've learned through my professional career is just that it's much messier than that. And that you can have big leaps forward, which are absolutely exciting. But you can also have, we've learned more recently, some pretty big leap backwards. Even things that you think wouldn't be able to go back can do. And I hope there are people out there studying that process and trying to find ways to protect us in the future once more gains are made, because it is scary and it is depressing.
Well, I wanted to retrace your career roots. You spent a chunk of your career in the Pugwash movement. which is a legacy movement of basically very high-level scientists with a conscience. In particular, and you and I both come from a background on nuclear weapons issues, but Pugwash, along with a few others, had its roots in scientists sort of dealing with the sort of the problem that they made with the invention of nuclear weapons. But the reason I thought it would be interesting to talk about here is that it's very much a movement with an ethos, with a sense of responsibility for making change and beliefs about how to make change. And so, we just wanted to ask you to sort of think back and reflect on what that organization and movement is about, and what you took from it in doing the work of advocacy.
Another easy question there. I think so. When I was studying as a student and I came across nuclear weapons issues, it was at the same time that I was also learning a bit about the Holocaust. I was learning kind of all of the things that we humans can do to each other that are beyond imaginable. I thought it was really important to try to work to get rid of an inhumane weapon. I consider nuclear weapons to be inhumane, and the Pugwash movement, I guess, caught my attention even all those years ago, because some of the greatest thinkers of the time, was founded based on a manifesto from Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell. It was signing the manifesto was the last public act of Einstein's life. What a legacy, saying that we have to learn to think in a new way. We have to remember our humanity and forget the rest. Those are words that have driven me through my whole career. And the challenge when you're working for an organization like that is that the whole premise of it was that you have to talk to people that you're not necessarily comfortable talking with. So back in the Cold War, it was set up so that the scientists from East and West had a place to talk, and they found a common language in science, and they were able to find ways forward on some of those pressing issues. This is after the H-bomb had been developed, and there was a real fear out there that, this was an existential threat. What most people, those who do know about the Pugwash movement, most people don't understand is that built right into it was this intergenerational thing. So Joseph Rotblat, who became one of my mentors, was the youngest signatory of the manifesto, and he was asked to chair the session where the manifesto was released to the world. He was in his, I think, 30s at the time. And there were people like Ruth Adams, who I suspect a lot of your listeners will know. They were young, dynamic, concerned people who had a link to all those early nuclear weapons scientists. Many of them were involved in then trying to roll back the creation that they had, or to help. They wanted to have nuclear disarmament. But it does have this internal moral dilemma, because it was the people who created the bomb then wanted to get rid of the bomb. And so there were, and through its history, even to today, there are people who still work within nuclear weapons establishments who are not supporters of immediate disarmament, but who share that long-term goal. of disarmament. And some may say that's an impossible way to frame things, but I read somewhere that it's important for an organization to be able to describe its purpose in 3 words. So while I was working for the International Pugwash Organization, I came up with dialogue across divides. And I think that's what is at the core of Pugwash then and Pugwash now, and effective policy making more broadly. I think that, and believe me, as an American sitting in some of the rooms I've been in, it has not always been comfortable. It's been far from comfortable. But I think that if you're going to try to solve a problem, you have to be willing to engage on all sides. And I accept that not everybody agrees with this, and that's legitimate too. But in terms of how I see working on policy, I think it's important that you assume that there's points of goodwill and where your goals can converge. And then that's where you get into all the messy, as you would call it, tradecraft, into how do you take the group of people you have, their level of connection and interest to the issues, what's possible in terms of moving forward, and how can you do more incremental steps while still feeling true to the overall goals. And that's messy and tricky, but somewhere in there, I think, is the way that some of the more inspired policies can be made. And it doesn't presume consensus, and it doesn't presume that there would be an agreement at the end of it. And part of the genius of the way that Pugwash has always been structured is that they, with the exception of things that are issued by the Pugwash Council, there is no consensus sought. There's a rapporteur for each meeting, and the reports are the views of that rapporteur only. I mean, they're meant to adequately represent what was discussed in the meeting. And maybe we're being too vague, but for your listeners who might not be familiar with it, some of the more recent Pugwash activity was involved in, prior to the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran, there were a whole series of meetings that looked at what a deal with Iran might look like, who are the various partners in the region that might be affected by it. There were meetings in different capitals involving different subgroups of people. There's a lot of work that was done at a very high level to flesh out some of that, but there was never an understanding that from each of those meetings there had to be an agreed point. So I really literally believe that the dialogue is the goal. And I had a senior, somebody from a government who was involved in funding some of these meetings, and had a really interesting discussion with him. And I know with your background, David, that you are always, you're probably more attuned to how does an organization prove to a funder outcomes and deliverables and all of those things that were meant to build into things. And this funder said how even within his own governmental structures, he has to say to people that sometimes just having the meeting is the outcome, that you don't always have to look for something after that to prove the power of it. And I think part of that gets to, I mean, this is all, you are taking me out of my comfort zone and having this discussion, because it's not that we normally sit back in our day, is it, and think, okay, what's the way that we go about doing what we do? We don't normally have time to do that in our busy kind of lives. But I think that we have to appreciate that sometimes those people-to-people connections, and certainly Joe Roplat said that about the first Pugwash conference and others that followed, that it was just looking eye to eye at somebody, being able to see their humanity, you find the connections. And that doesn't mean that when people go back to where they're from, that they don't still have a battle to fight in their political corridors of power. But if you get the right people and you create an environment conducive to getting past some of the bravado that can happen in formal meetings on your own, I believe that we should always be trying to to put ourselves in discussions where the outcome will be something that you wouldn't have been able to think about on your own in your own silo.
To pick up a discussion that we had years ago, you and I can both agree that this major problem of nuclear weapons in the world, and we totally share the perspective that there is no rational military use for something so catastrophically deadly and destructive. But the interesting thing that we've talked about in the past is, okay, the ultimate goal is to have zero nuclear weapons. That comes with its own genie out of the problem. Can't, a genie out of the bottle can't uninvent a technology issues. And, what if one side has a few nuclear weapons still, right? That's that has its own problems. It's a long way of coming around to the question: if you have a long-range goal like that, is it always imperative or important or useful or needed to feature that ultimate goal? Do you need to be loudly pointing toward it, keeping it in view, featuring it, or can you sort of feel your way there and have it come into focus as you get closer?
Well, if Joseph Rapplat was sitting here, he used to say that his short-term goal was the elimination of nuclear weapons and his long-term goal was the elimination of war. And that too was built into the Russell Einstein manifesto. I mean, I haven't been working on nuclear issues now for the last 6 or 7 years. And I'm not sorry to say that, because in those years, there's been a turn back of the clock in ways that I didn't think was possible. But I mean, you said it. These are weapons that shouldn't be used in war, don't have a place. If you don't have that long-term aim is actually the thing that can help unite to bring people around the table. People who wouldn't normally sit there. It's the incremental steps that is under debate. I mean, Pugwash meetings with people from all different parts of the world. Most people will say that, yes, they agree that there shouldn't be nuclear weapons in the world. And then it gets down to the specifics of how to do it. Washington, D.C., from my time there, I don't know if it's still the same, I'm going to assume it was, you, just by saying that, sometimes one would be considered unrealistic and not a true player, not an insider. And it's why I never went. I have a degree in strategic studies. I was, the normal people who went through my course were meant to go work inside State Department or Department of Defense. But I thought it was really important to have that kind of background and to use it then to lobby for change. And one of the things that a mutual boss that you and I had when I was applying for the job, I had learned so much how to hide my long-term aim. I nearly didn't get the job working for the organization we worked for together because in my interview, I wasn't saying what my goal was. And at one point, the then director turned to me and he said, "So what you're saying is, why do you want to work here?" And I gave this reason that I thought it was interesting to see, have help to work on these issues that are important. He said, but this could have just been bird watching then. That was the famous quote. So this could be bird watching. It doesn't have to be about nuclear weapons. And that's when then I said what I actually believe about nuclear weapons, and that's what got me the job.
Well, I think you're mentioning the two different, the international context versus the Washington context is really very on point here. A lot of the international political dynamic around this issue has to do with the haves and the have-nots, right? So when an American is involved in these discussions internationally, of course, there's a consciousness that the United States is the country that, has more than any other country with one possible exception, and is the only country that's used them. And so, there's the problem of getting the have country to give them up. That's where, my hesitance about pointing towards that ultimate goal comes in, right? Because I think when you think about what you have to overcome, what you have to break through as a status quo, that there's that pointing towards that goal maybe provokes resistance, baggage to bring into the discussion to talk about abolition now. I'm going to take one different stab at this, which is I've always thought that when you get down to the triple digits in terms of the size of the arsenal, and then beyond that down to kind of the dozens of a nuclear arsenal in terms of how much you have, that you've already accomplished a great deal. But number two, you'll be confronting the remaining issues in a new way, in a new context, and they will present themselves differently. So that's my argument for, maybe going a little softer sell on the abolition.
I don't know. I'm just thinking back in all of the meetings that I've been part of, if this is still particularly about Pugwash, the experience there. And every single meeting is about incremental steps. I don't think that the knowing that the ultimate goal is disarmament stopped any meetings. And in fact, sometimes in the Middle East or in some other parts of the world, being able to say that we all share that goal, South Asia, other, sometimes that provides the ability to have the discussions about the incremental steps. So it goes both ways.
Sure, that's that international audience.
But
meanwhile, back at the superpower.
Oh yeah, so let's talk about. I mean, I don't know. This is why I'm glad to be living on the other side of the ocean right now. So what else do we have? We've got, and by the way, there were some great promises made, we thought, about getting towards a nuclear weapons-free world by Obama and others, and the follow-through was pretty unimpressive in terms of historical footprint on those things. But what are other, climate change? Do the kids out on the streets want to have a debate about whether the end goal is to, have a world where we don't have a climate emergency? What does it harm to say that? And obviously the steps towards there are different from everybody's perspective. Or gun control. Why can't we say that we don't want people to have the ability easily to kill themselves? I think the other side of the coin, the people who we would say are some of the biggest anti-people to these sorts of visions, they are not mincing their words. Have you listened to Donald Trump on the news the last couple of days? Have you listened to Boris Johnson on the news the last couple of days? Do any of these people care about nuances of the kind that we're talking about? I mean, they are just bowling over any kind of nuance. They don't care. They're using language that is so far beyond anything that we're discussing right now, and they're getting millions of followers. So I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, when I started this, I don't know what I'd be doing if I was still in that field. I think one of the things that Pugwash, just today they're announcing that Russia's deployed nuclear weapons in Belarus. I don't know if that's true or not. That's what the reports are. So you've got, for the first time in many, many, many years, you've got a rollback to deployment of nuclear weapons. These are scary, scary days. And while you might say that the arms control treaties that we had that were meant to protect us didn't protect us, some other people might have said, well, if we all thought bigger and bolder after the end of the Soviet Union, and maybe we didn't need to keep NATO going, maybe we needed to think differently about some of this, maybe we wouldn't be where we are today if we had been more willing to talk and to bridge those divides and to look beyond a purely military security kind of paradigm. I feel like we're spread across 100 different issues right now, and I know that's what you're trying to do in the discussion. But I say it still comes back to, even now, like in this situation with Belarus and Russia, there has to be the only way these things are ever going to change is eventually somebody's going to sit down and talk. That's the only way things change.
Mostly this is reminding me why I wanted to talk about it. And just to be clear, so my point isn't to defend how America has used its power. I understand the critique, and it's a fair one, right? So that's my point about the international discussion and the international politics. I press the question because what I find interesting for the purpose of the podcast and the purpose of our work is just to reflect on the relationship between transformation and transformative goals, and incremental change. And maybe all I'm saying is that it is different in these different cases. You brought in climate change. I could just as easily bring in healthcare reform and single payer, right? Maybe I'm just speaking up for thinking about the relationship between ultimate goal and immediate. I mean, it is hard to argue against the reality that we have to be headed towards a decarbonized economy. It's pretty radical, but also essential. My basic point is about understanding maybe the politics that go with pointing towards that goal. I mean, I take your point that we haven't succeeded, but I'm kind of still here feeling like you have to look at the resistance to change. You have to look at the reaction to different agendas. And I think it's a sad reality of the world that I don't think that we can copy the other side's playbook. And I don't just mean that from the perspective of we wouldn't want to be like them. I don't think it would work for us. I mean, that's part of that, kind of disparity that we started the conversation with in terms of how the right wing kind of gets away with things. There's a kind of handle with kid gloves. I don't think the center left could pull it off.
But I do think that there's, this is bringing back some, PTSD for me, thinking back to the time in Washington, but it applies here too. I think one of the most important things about policy advocacy from a progressive side of things is that you always have to keep, as a progressive organization, you always have to keep slightly to the left, or maybe even not just slightly to the left of where the main policy is. And if you don't, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the people who are in power if they're seen to be too closely aligned with progressive organizations, and it doesn't help progressive organizations when they're pushing for change. But time and time and time again, I would see when Democrats would come in and people in the DC think tanks and arms control groups and disarmament groups, they would treat the policymakers who were closer aligned to them than the others in a different way. And they didn't keep the pressure up in the same way. And that happened repeatedly. And because they wanted access, it became about access rather than, and to be fair, it came from the other direction too, where I remember being in a meeting with an extremely senior aide to one of the presidents, who then sat there, and we thought, okay, this is great. Got the right people in power now. Here we are sitting, and this guy sat back, and he listened to everything, and he was nodding and he was agreeing. And then at the end of it, he said to the more eminent people from the progressive groups around the room than I was, for sure. I was young, and he said, "Well, really glad that we had this discussion. But you, of course, understand that we have to keep this between us now. And now when we leave this room, we hope that you won't be criticizing us out there in public." And that's the way the next years went, that the groups who previously had not been, from my perspective, I'm sure some of the people would have different ideas about this. But I think, I don't know what I'm saying exactly, but I think it's really depressing that when the moments come when the more progressive forces come into power, that's almost when the foot needs to be on the accelerator rather than come off the accelerator for change. And that doesn't always happen.
Maybe another way of putting it is that if someone is an incrementalist, the burden of proof on the incrementalist is that incremental change is actually being achieved, right? I mean, it can't come up empty-handed because that only sort of proves the uselessness of it.
But I do feel like in this moment, we started talking about Trump. I don't feel like this discussion even applies anymore, because things are so extreme and changes are happening of such a big way out there. So, take what I'm saying with 2 cents, 2 pinches of salt, or whatever the right phrase is, because I really don't know what we.
No, the world has forced us onto an agenda to just preserve democracy, right? So, first things first,
and ensure education of the next generation.
We got to keep the fascists from taking over.
Yeah, And they're here.
Right. Well, on that cheery note, I mean, this has provoked the discussions that I've wanted to have, which I appreciate. So thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've wound the clock back a lot, obviously. let's wind it forward to the new context that you've been working in, related to kids who have lifelong issues and disabilities related to the pregnancy and what their birth mothers were doing. And so here you are now in this context about services and support needed and being underserved. What have you brought with you? What are the through lines in terms of skills or tactics? When have you found yourself in this new context drawing on old capabilities?
Well, that happens every day, pretty much. I made this scary leap after almost 30 years working on nuclear weapons and disarmament and international security sorts of issues to move to run the National Organization for Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder here in the UK. And I remember one of the people I knew from Pugwash, Herbert York, who is a name that might be familiar to some, he once said to me that opportunities come along, and the trick is that you need to take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves, even if it's not something you were anticipating. And so, I made a career switch, and the reason why I did it is because one of my children has FASD, and I knew that I had some skills and some background that might be able to help make the world better for him and others like him when I'm no longer here. And so I did the big scary thing, and I jumped communities and landed myself in health policy issues for which I had no background at all. None. I mean, I don't, but I did know how to read policy briefs. I did know with the Pugwash experience was directly relevant because it was all about Franklin Hippel's idea of the citizen scientist. So part of what I've been doing with my work is helping to bridge doctors and other practitioners who wouldn't normally get involved in policy debates into the debates because they needed to be heard. I mean, there were people doing this. This isn't a community that, it had been going since for a very long time. And I don't mean to overemphasize my own input, but the idea that we need to include the voices of people who are affected by an issue. You think of the power of the Hibakusha voice in the nuclear disarmament stuff. For FASD, one of the first things I did was to help to amplify the voices of people who have FASD and the people who care for them, the people most affected by it, to put them directly in front of very senior policymakers. So there's no squirm room. I mean, there was one roundtable in particular with the deputy chief medical officer and leads from all of the other, the relevant departments. And the room was full of people. Well, it was small. There were about 6 people with FASD and their families and some of the rest of us in the room. And one adult who was in his early 30s just spoke his truth, man. Speak truth to power. We grew up probably saying that on college campuses, but we provided the opportunity for that to happen. And long story short, but out of that meeting and some others that we did and other ways that we channeled, helped the voices of people most affected get into the corridors of power. I'm really proud to say that there's been a complete turning point over here. And now unlike 3 or 4 years ago now, every public health body has emphasized the importance of FASD. There's been a needs assessment done that outlines what needs to change, and there's standards that have been put in place to show where quality of care needs to improve. And I've even taken the manifesto with the people with FASD have just issued their FASD manifesto saying how they want to be treated out there in the world. I've done a series of Pugwash style roundtables. Yeah, no, it's all the same.
Right, but you go from one of the world's most intractable, hard to make progress issues towards one that's, a little easier to get traction and get progress.
Well, it wasn't. I mean, it's been decades that people have been trying this. This is since the 1970s that FASD was known about, and it's only
sure.
And it's only now. But I do think that all of us, everybody, no matter what you've done, everybody has their skill set that they can bring to an issue, and it's just finding the place and time for that to have impact, and to find your allies and how to work with them and to set the goals. And the hard thing is, though, that the policy doesn't change people's lives instantly. All these things, we have helplines, and people are in crisis because now they've got the policy, but it's like Obama says, we're going to have a nuclear weapons free world, and then we don't get one. Here there's people have said what the goal is for improving the lives for people with FASD, and it's not happening. And the time
implementation matters.
The time change is long.
It's the piece.
It's a generational thing. The people suffering now under the inaction are probably not going to benefit from it. But they too, those people too, want this change to happen because they don't want people who come after them to experience what they've experienced. So I don't know. It's all the same thing. It's just finding your moment and finding the allies. With this issue, you never know who an ally is because most people with FASD have never been diagnosed, and they're talking, the statistics are it's somewhere between 2 to 4% of the population. So more people have it than autism. So you find that in corridors of power, in the media, in different rooms, there will usually be somebody who has a personal connection to it, whether or not they're aware of that. In the States, there's the big FASD Act is making headway over there, and I hope that people pay attention to it. That's the next step. Over here, we would need something like that to help people. So I don't know. The lessons are the importance of dialogue. If you have something to give and you have a passion for it, you find where you can be most effective. For me, I just think I've got a limited amount of time on this planet, and I want to leave the world better for people when I can. And in this case, in particular, for my son and others like him who have been so overlooked for so long. Alcohol is...
And you're here to say that if you take that big professional career leap into unfamiliar waters, that it can work out. It can work out well, and it can be a great chance to make a difference.
Yeah, you never know. I mean, you and I have also talked about the benefits of liberal arts education, and I think that I did have a background because I had a liberal arts education. I did do some psychology. There are some bits and pieces of in my way back background that I've been able to call on for this. Kids over here in England don't get liberal arts backgrounds. That's a whole other topic for a different day. I think at the end of the day, though, it's just, I really do believe that we all can make a difference on this planet in whatever way we want to. And it's a choice. If you don't, it's a choice where you put your energy. And what I've learned in my career is you can put your energy on a very local level. You can put your energy in your home. You can put your energy on an international scale. It's all the same amount of energy. It's just where you you focus it. And so being a little bit clever about, and find the people who can help you know where you can be of most influence is helpful. And to encourage, I wouldn't have done any of this if I didn't have people way more, people who I never thought would look twice at me, let alone seek to mentor me. And so I think we all have a responsibility to pay that forward when we can. And David, that includes you.
Well,
when I first started working for the organization, you were, and I was literally just telling my staff about this the other day, you were working on editing a newsletter that was being read across NATO and State Department all over the world. And for some reason, you took time to help me in that very high pressure environment to understand what makes good writing, to understand talk about tradecraft, what makes how you edit. I just told somebody the other day they needed to read their document backwards to catch all the typos, and they looked at me like I had three heads. I said, "Try it." I learned that from a wizard.
Remember that trick?
Yeah, no, and it's those things that you pay forward that you don't even realize at the time are big lessons, and they're important, and then you pay it.
You're very nice, and it's been a pleasure and a joy to keep up with you over all of these years, and I thank you so much for coming on my little podcast and talking about these things. This has been great.
It is, and I thank you for doing the podcast. I was looking through and listening to some of your other ones, and I think that you've always had the big picture, and somehow it's definitely outside comfort zones to talk in this way, and yet it's one of your particular skills.
You were referring to evaluators and evaluation before, and I think even more important from the perspective of this side of the work, even more important than looking for how progress manifests is the ongoing process of learning. I think that's reflection and learning from experience is what evaluators want above all. So
I used to have on my university dorm wall, I forget who sang the song, but the quote that it's got to be the going, not the getting there, that's good. And I really believe that, because how we do what we do and the interactions we have and the connections we make and how we nurture those connections and how we walk through the world, especially the policy world, really matters. And I can divide my life in terms of the people who I'd like to stay in touch with and who I think were compassionate, empathetic, forward thinkers, rebels in their own way, not satisfied with the status quo. Those are the people we need to hold on to and nurture. And what I really worry about in some of the power structures that exist, especially today, I really worry that those people are not wanting to stay in the community, and somehow as a community we have to keep them because they're where the hope is. If we lose that the policy muscle, we've already lost arms control muscle from a lot of different capitals because there's been so little of it happening. We need to keep that nurturing of these skill sets, and that's why I think what you're doing is really important here.
To any early career folks out there who might be listening, the friends and colleagues and relationships that you have right now, you might still have them 35 years from now, if you can even imagine it. Thanks again.